Today I thought I'd show you a cute macro, just a small macro. And for me, when it comes to macros, there are two kinds that I like in particular. And one of them is the really complex macro that you'll see in crates like Tokyo, for example, this select macro. And sometimes if you use enough macro magic, then you don't need to use a procedural macro, which are you have to compile them separately, and that increases the compilation time. Whereas if you do enough magic on the side, the declarative, the regular macro side, then you don't need to use it. And this is kind of interesting. If you look at the Tokyo source code, they're using let's see, well, it is possible to implement fully with a declarative macro. Procedural macro is used, blah blah blah, but they're doing a whole bunch of work to use just a regular select, and that's what we use all the time in async code. And if you look at this, so there's something called count inside here. There's another macro, and the code for this is pretty funny, but you can see it's just super long, and we're not going to look at this, but this kind of incredibly complex macro is always impressive. And then here, this count macro, and here we manually list out matches for up to 64 branches, and the person who wrote it actually says, I'm not happy about it either, but this is how we managed to use a declarative macro. So they're using all this crazy, manually implementing all these possible lengths just in order to avoid using a procedural macro. So yeah, all of that sort of wizardry is always impressive. And then the other kind of macro I like is just this sort of simple macro, and this is inside the SurrealDB crate. And you can see there is a function here, and I like simple macros as well because you can easily imagine how you might want to use this, and it just makes your code readable. So you can see here, for example, there's a function called OS, and it gives the operating system of the current machine, and then it has this macro called get config, get cfg, and then all of a sudden this thing shows up, this function, target OS. And if you look inside the macro code here, you can see this is how it is done. And what is up with the screen? There we go. So you can see it just has, so there's going to be one identifier, so you give it a name, and then there's a whole bunch of, well, maybe there's at least one expression, there can be more, and you can see it has the $sign here, separated by commas, plus, so one or more, and then there's going to be expressions inside, and then for each time, or rather, it says let's. So this is going to be the name of a function, or rather a closure. You can see it's making a closure here, and then every time there's an expression that comes in, then it'll say if config, and this is the regular config macro that we have. If I equals s, then return s, and it does that all the way to the end, and then at the very end, it says unknown. So we can just stick it in here and give it a try. So we can say, let's see, how did they do it? Let's, that's right, just get config. And then we'll say, what are we going to look at? Windows, Mac OS, Linux. This is going to match for the Rust playground. So we'll stick that in there. There we go. And then all we have to do is go to expand macros, and this would be cargo expand in no rules expected that. All right, because I didn't give the name. What do they call it? Target OS. That's the. So we're going to make a function, or rather a closure called target OS, and then there you go. So once you click on expand macros, you can see that. Let's see if the expansion is working. All right. It's expecting a colon. Now it's going to work. There you go. So you can see the actual generated code. Move that up there, so it has here's the actual macro declaration itself, and then over here, this is the code that it returns. So you can see it generates this kind of like, this is code you never want to write yourself. If false, so it's actually doing the match already. If config I equals S, and that's going to be false because this is generated on a non-Windows machine. So it's just going to say if false, if false, if false, and of course that's going to not return anything. And then at the very end it says true because this happens to be running on a Linux machine. If true, return Linux, and then finally unknown. And so that is going to generate target OS. So that is going to generate something that just prints out Linux like that. And then if we take out Linux, then it should say unknown. So there you go. At the very end there, it turns to unknown. If we look at the generated output here, again, it just says if false, if false, if false, and then finally at the very end returns unknown. So yeah, small macros can be pretty neat.